The first time I realized that peace on my lakefront property was about to be shattered was not when I saw the line of cars snaking toward the dirt road, or even when the thumping of distant bass rattled the windows of my mansion, but rather when I opened my mailbox and pulled out a glossy flyer advertising a beach festival that was apparently going to be held right on my land, without my consent, and with my mansion listed as the grand venue, complete with VIP seating and fireworks, and at that moment I knew that the HOA's loudest mouth and most persistent nightmare, Karen, had not only crossed the line but had built a parade on it and invited 100 strangers to march across my property, and I decided then and there that I was going to let her think she had won just long enough for me to lock the only gate and watch the circus collapse from the comfort of my porch. I had bought the lake mansion years ago for its quiet isolation, the kind of place where you could hear a loon's call echo across the water and think about nothing but how perfect the ripples looked under a morning breeze. Yet here I was holding a flyer with Karen's face printed beside phrases like Summer Bash Extravaganza and Bring Your Own Booze and Camp Out by the Lake, and it was laughable and enraging all at once because Karen did not just have audacity, she had an engine fueled entirely by it. She was the sort of person who thought rules were clay she could shape with enough whining and confidence, and she had somehow convinced an entire board of equally clueless HOA members that my private property was theirs to lend out like a community park. That morning I stood on the deck with coffee in hand, staring out at the still water, already imagining the chaos of drunken strangers trampling my docks, tents littering my shoreline, and bass shaking the timbers of my boathouse, and I swore silently that Karen's big event was going to backfire so hard that the echoes would bounce off every house in the neighborhood. The escalation began quickly. Trucks with trailers full of folding chairs rattled past, honking as if they were arriving at a concert venue. Karen strutted around in oversized sunglasses, barking orders to people unloading equipment near the community entrance as though she were a general commanding troop. She never once looked toward me on the porch, which was her way of pretending I did not exist, though I could see her jaw tighten whenever she thought no one was watching. She had promised 100 guests a day on my beach, and she was committed to staging her fantasy festival even if it meant trespassing. My phone buzzed with texts from confused neighbors asking if I really rented the mansion to the HOA, and I responded with nothing but laughing emojis because the less I said, the bigger the blow-up would be when reality hit. Karen loved attention, and she had set herself up for the performance of a lifetime. She planted colorful banners along the road, and even a sign reading Festival Parking this way with an arrow pointing straight to my gate. She waved her clipboard like a royal scepter while giving interviews to curious guests arriving early, talking about community unity and celebration of summer. I sipped my coffee and marveled at how many lies could pour from her in such a short span, and I thought how sweet it would be when that flood of words hit the dam I was building with one simple padlock. Every good plan needed a touch of patience, and mine was to wait until her entire circus was gathered before snapping the chain shut, ensuring maximum embarrassment at minimum effort. Of course, part of me wondered how far she would really go. Karen was the type to double down even when cornered, so I pictured her claiming squatters' rights, waiving fake permits, or trying to crawl over the fence in her designer sandals. I could almost hear her shrieking voice in my head yelling about how her guests had dietary needs and schedules to keep, as if that gave her the right to rewrite property law. But what she had not counted on was how much I enjoyed letting her dig her own pit. The more she prepared, the deeper she sank, and all I had to do was step back and make sure the cameras around the gate were working perfectly because evidence was always sweeter when it came with moving pictures and sound. By the afternoon, a convoy of cars had parked along the roadside, and I saw people unloading coolers, inflatable rafts, even a karaoke machine. The audacity made me chuckle so hard I nearly spilled my drink. Karen pranced between them, snapping selfies, posting updates, and promising the festival would be the event of the year. She didn't realize she was building the stage for her own humiliation, and I intended to be the amused audience with the best seat in the house. Neighbors gathered at a distance, some pretending to support her, others too amused to intervene, and I caught whispers carried on the breeze about how it would all end. None of them knew I already had the new padlock hidden in my pocket, gleaming and ready for its starring role. As night fell, the preparations only grew louder. String lights twinkled near the road, music tested speakers with bursts of static and bass, and Karen shrieked at volunteers about where to place the portable toilet. I watched the chaos unfold from my window, grinning at how much time, money, and effort was being poured into an event that would never reach its stage. The real show would start in the morning when 100 guests showed up and realized they were stuck outside the only gate with nothing but Karen's broken promises. The thought alone carried me to bed with the kind of satisfaction most people get from winning the lottery, because tomorrow was going to be better than any comedy special streaming on television. That night I dreamed of gates clanging shut, of Karen's voice cracking in desperation, of the rising murmur of a crowd that realized they had been duped. I dreamed of the calm lake behind me, still untouched, still safe, still mine. When I woke at dawn, the dream had sharpened into purpose. I dressed, grabbed the heavy chain and padlock, and walked quietly to the gate as the sky brightened. Not a soul noticed me slipping the metal through the posts and snapping it shut with a satisfying click. I patted the lock like an old friend and whispered, "Showtime." The air smelled of lake water and impending disaster, and I knew I had just set the stage for the most entertaining day of my life. The hook was already in place, the tension wound tighter than the chain I had just looped, and as I walked back to the mansion with the sun rising over the water, I could almost hear the opening act begin in my head, because in just a few hours Karen's grand illusion would slam into cold steel, and the echo of that padlock snapping shut would be the funniest sound this lake had ever heard. Morning arrived with the hum of car engines lining the road like a swarm of bees converging on honey, and the honey in question was my lake mansion, or at least that was what Karen had promised her guests, because one by one vehicles of every shape and size crept along the gravel and piled up near the entrance while people in beach attire spilled out carrying folding chairs, umbrellas, and bags of snacks as though they were preparing for a carnival. I stood behind my blinds with coffee in hand, marveling at how delusion could snowball into this kind of fiasco, because the longer I watched the more absurd it became, from a minivan unloading 6 inflatable rafts to a pickup truck stacked with what looked like an entire barbecue rig, complete with propane tanks and skewers, and through it all Karen strutted in front of the gate with her clipboard raised high as if she were a world-famous festival director greeting VIPs. She had that grin plastered on her face, the one she always wore when she thought she had finally outsmarted me, and she waved her arms dramatically as she shouted instructions about where to park and how to line up the guests who had purchased what she called early bird access, which I assumed meant they had handed her money under the table for this disaster. The noise was impossible to ignore, thumping bass already blasting from a set of oversized speakers propped against a truck bed, the air shaking with each beat as though the ground itself had joined the rebellion. My neighbors, who usually complained about children riding bicycles too close to their driveways, now stood at a safe distance with their arms crossed, watching Karen's spectacle unfold with expressions torn between horror and fascination, because even they knew this was no longer petty squabbling about lawn decorations. This was a full-scale invasion of private property wrapped in beach towels and sunblock. Children ran around with inflatable beach balls, adults cracked open beers before the sun had even fully risen, and Karen kept shouting about the schedule, promising fireworks after sundown and a midnight lake swim as though the mansion and shoreline belonged to her family for generations. She was drunk on her own delusion, and I could practically taste the sweet crash that was headed her way when the gate, already sealed tight with my padlock, refused to open. I decided to stroll down casually, keeping a low profile at first, because nothing would thrill me more than watching her believe she was winning right up until the point reality slapped her across the face. The smell of sunscreen and gasoline mixed in the air, clashing with the usual crisp lake breeze, and I walked past parked cars where guests were setting up lawn chairs right there on the roadside, as though the dirt and gravel made for a proper festival ground. A group of teenagers were already snapping selfies in front of the gate sign that clearly stated private property, no trespassing, and when I coughed loud enough for them to hear, they simply shrugged and posed with their peace signs, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Karen noticed me then, her sunglasses sliding down her nose as she froze for just a moment before regaining her composure, waving her clipboard at me with that mock-friendly smile that had fooled no one in the 10 years I had known her. She chirped about how happy she was to see me and how wonderful it was that I had decided to open my property to the community, saying it loud enough for half the crowd to hear, as though she could cement her lie by sheer volume, but I only nodded and told her I hoped she had everything under control. Inside I was laughing so hard it nearly spilled out of me, but I kept my poker face because the reveal had to be perfectly timed. By noon the situation had grown even more chaotic. Cars stretched so far down the road that they clogged the small intersection by the community entrance, horns honking in frustration while Karen shouted back at them to be patient because entry would begin soon. Vendors showed up with food trucks that had been promised a spot by the water, only to find themselves stuck in the middle of a line of vehicles with nowhere to go. One truck selling tacos started serving right there on the shoulder, people eating greasy tortillas while leaning against their cars. Music blasted louder, portable grills smoked, and laughter filled the air, but beneath it all I sensed the rumble of tension, the kind that grows when promises outpace reality. People began asking Karen when exactly they would be allowed inside, and she kept pointing at her watch, muttering about the gates opening shortly. Each minute that passed wound the crowd tighter, and I leaned against a tree watching with glee, because the lock was holding firm and the suspense was building beautifully. Karen, desperate to keep control, began organizing a line of guests at the gate, telling them to have their wristbands ready, which only made things more absurd because she had apparently printed custom plastic bands with glittery letters that read Lake Bash 2025. Watching grown adults slip on cheap wristbands to stand in line outside my locked gate nearly made me choke on my laughter, and yet the crowd went along, forming a queue that stretched down the road, chattering excitedly as if they were about to step into a music festival worth hundreds of dollars. She strutted along the line, shaking hands, kissing babies like a politician, promising that this was going to be the most legendary HOA event ever held. Meanwhile I sipped another coffee and thought about how sweet it would be when her credibility imploded in front of all these people she had swindled. When the sun reached its peak and the air shimmered with heat, the first real cracks appeared. A man in sunglasses asked why the gate wasn't open yet, gesturing to the heavy chain and padlock, and Karen brushed him off by claiming the owner, meaning me, had agreed to personally cut the ribbon at exactly 1 o'clock. She even pretended to check her phone and nod at a fake text message, saying I was on my way. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people checked the time, sweat rolling down their backs, beer cans piling up at their feet, and Karen clapped her hands together, trying to keep the energy alive by announcing a surprise raffle. She pulled out slips of paper from her clipboard and handed out tickets, but the grumbling did not stop. Guests had traveled hours, some had hauled camping gear, and now they were standing on hot gravel staring at a locked gate while their supposed host babbled about community fun. I leaned back, arms crossed, letting her desperation ferment. Every time someone questioned her, she grew shriller, promising that just a few more minutes were needed, that I was merely delayed, that everything was still on schedule. She even handed out bottled water from a cooler in her car, as though bribing the crowd with lukewarm plastic bottles would make them forget the glaring padlocks staring them in the face. At one point she whispered to a pair of men carrying tools, gesturing discreetly at the gate, and they wandered over with confused expressions before deciding against it when they realized half the crowd was watching. She retreated quickly, her mask of control beginning to crack, and I smiled knowing it was only the beginning. As the afternoon dragged on, the line dissolved into clumps of irritated people shading themselves with umbrellas and towels. Children grew cranky, adults snapped at each other, and the music sputtered as one of the speakers overheated and cut out. Food truck vendors honked impatiently, demanding to know where they were supposed to set up. Karen's voice grew hoarse as she tried to keep up her charade, inventing reasons, promising refunds she clearly couldn't afford, and whispering to her inner circle that I was sabotaging her out of spite. Little did she know I was just letting her sabotage herself, one lie at a time. The tension in the air thickened, and I knew tomorrow's chaos would make today look like a warm-up, but for now I basked in the spectacle, content to watch Karen juggle her crumbling festival while the padlock gleamed in the sunlight, silent and unyielding, the star of the show she never saw coming. The morning of the festival dawned bright and unforgiving, the kind of morning where sunlight burned across the water like a mirror and every sound carried clearly for miles, and from the moment I stepped onto my porch I knew the day would be unforgettable because the road leading to my locked gate was already swarming with cars, tents pitched haphazardly in ditches, and people pacing impatiently with coolers and folding chairs clutched in sweaty hands. The padlock on the gate gleamed like a jewel, solid and unmovable, and I felt a surge of satisfaction that no speech, no demand, and no tantrum could change the fact that the key was in my pocket and nowhere else. Karen stood near the front of the crowd with her oversized sunglasses pushed up into her hair, barking into her phone, waving her clipboard like a shield, and trying desperately to look calm even as her guests muttered and pointed at the chain stretched across the iron bars. I could hear snippets of their conversations drifting up the road, people asking when they were getting in, others demanding refunds, and a few openly wondering whether this was even legal. The tension rolled off them in waves, thick and sticky like the humidity hanging in the air, and Karen's voice cracked as she promised, yet again, that everything was under control. It did not take long for the first confrontation to erupt. A man in a Hawaiian shirt with a half-crushed beer can in his fist marched up to Karen and demanded to know why he and his family had driven 3 hours only to be stuck on the roadside. Karen, ever the improviser, threw her arms out dramatically and declared that the ribbon-cutting ceremony had been delayed due to unforeseen circumstances, but that I, the generous landowner, was on my way to perform the grand opening myself. She even made a show of checking her phone and nodding, as though reading a text from me, though the screen was clearly black and locked. The man was not convinced, and neither were the growing number of onlookers who shuffled closer, their eyes darting between the stubbornly locked gate and Karen's increasingly frantic gestures. From my perch behind the blinds, I could see the shift in the crowd, the first glimmers of doubt flickering in their faces, and I smiled because the stage was set for the spectacle I had been anticipating. The first wave of shouting began around 10 o'clock, when the sun was already heating the asphalt and tempers began to boil alongside it. Guests stamped their feet, fanned themselves with paper plates, and accused Karen of poor planning. She countered with louder promises, shouting over the crowd that everything had been approved, that she had personally coordinated with me, that they were minutes away from stepping into the most luxurious lake mansion they had ever seen. To her credit, Karen had mastered the art of lying with conviction, but conviction could not melt steel or snap a padlock, and every time someone tugged at the gate only to feel it hold firm, the cracks in her performance widened. At one point she clapped her hands together, announcing a surprise warm-up event right there outside the gate, and coaxed a group of teenagers to set up a speaker and blast music while others started dancing on the gravel. For a few minutes it almost worked, the crowd distracted by the makeshift roadside party, but as soon as the song ended and the dust settled, the reality of the locked gate returned stronger than ever. Around noon, as sweat-drenched shirts and the smell of spilled beer mixed with sunscreen and exhaust fumes, Karen's composure slipped further. She paced back and forth, snapping at her volunteers, whispering frantically into her phone, and even trying to tug discreetly at the chain herself before stepping back and announcing that I had installed it as part of the ceremony. When a woman with 2 toddlers shouted that this was ridiculous and threatened to call the police, Karen's face turned red, but she plastered on a smile and said she had already spoken with law enforcement and that everything was authorized. The lie was bold, and for a moment it bought her silence, but then a pickup truck arrived carrying a group of latecomers, who leaned out the windows and shouted that they had paid hefty admission fees and wanted to know why they were stuck outside. The murmurs grew into an angry chorus, and Karen raised her clipboard above her head like a preacher raising a Bible, shouting that no one should panic, that this was a community event and everyone would get in as soon as the final preparations were finished. I could barely contain my laughter as I watched her stumble through excuse after excuse, the padlock still shining smugly in the sun. By mid-afternoon the road had turned into a madhouse, with cars parked in ditches, people lounging on coolers, and arguments breaking out between strangers who blamed each other for taking up too much space. A man tried to squeeze his sedan past the line and got stuck in a ditch, wheels spinning while his wife shouted at him from the passenger seat, and the crowd cheered sarcastically as 3 others tried to push the car out. Children cried, music cut in and out from dying speakers, and the air grew thick with frustration. Karen's voice was hoarse from repeating the same empty promises, yet she clung to her role like a drowning woman clutching driftwood, telling anyone who would listen that the grand entrance would happen any minute now. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment the crowd turned on her in unison. A group of guests, tired of waiting, marched up to the gate and shook it hard, rattling the chain until the metal clanged like a bell, and shouted that they wanted answers. Karen rushed forward, throwing her arms wide as if to physically block them, screaming that they would ruin the surprise, but her protests were drowned out by boos and jeers. Someone shouted that she had scammed them, another accused her of pocketing their money, and soon the air was thick with accusations. She waved her clipboard desperately, insisting she had receipts, insisting she had arranged everything, insisting that I was the one holding things up, but no one believed her anymore. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her, a queen stripped of her crown, standing in front of a crowd that no longer respected her. Police finally arrived, their sirens slicing through the chaos, and the crowd parted reluctantly to let them through. 2 officers stepped out, hands on their belts, surveying the scene with tired expressions that said they had been through this sort of nonsense before. Karen rushed to them like a drowning woman spotting a lifeboat, shrieking that I had locked her guests out illegally, that I had sabotaged her event, that I was abusing my power as a landowner. The officers listened silently, exchanged a glance, and then calmly asked her one simple question. Did she have any written agreement proving she had the right to host a festival on private property? The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her clipboard shaking in her hands, and when she finally managed to stammer something about verbal contracts and community spirit, the crowd erupted in laughter and groans. The officers turned to the padlock, examined it briefly, then shrugged and told Karen that private property was private property, and without documentation she had no leg to stand on. The crowd's mood shifted instantly, the frustration they had aimed at the gate now redirected squarely at her. People shouted for refunds, others stormed back to their cars, slamming doors and peeling away in clouds of dust, and those who stayed berated her loudly, calling her a liar and a scammer. Karen's face burned red as she tried to shout over them, promising that she would fix everything, that the event wasn't ruined, but her words were drowned out by the chaos around her. I leaned against the porch railing, sipping a cold drink, and savored every second of it. The padlock had done its job beautifully, holding firm against the storm while exposing Karen for exactly what she was. The festival that was supposed to cement her legacy as queen of the HOA had collapsed into a roadside riot, and I hadn't even had to raise my voice. The best part was that the day wasn't over yet, and I knew that Karen, desperate and humiliated, would not walk away quietly. The real fireworks, the kind that didn't come from any box of sparklers, were still to come. The aftermath of the police visit left the crowd restless and Karen's carefully fabricated authority in tatters, but if there was one thing I knew about her it was that she would never admit defeat even when her back was pressed so hard against the wall that she left an imprint. I watched her pace in front of the locked gate, her sunglasses abandoned, her clipboard bent from where she had clenched it too tightly, her voice raw from screaming excuses to the officers who had already left with little more than a warning to keep the road clear. Guests milled around aimlessly, half of them arguing for refunds while the other half demanded she call me directly, but Karen had long since run out of ways to bluff. Instead, she threw her shoulders back and announced loudly that I had deceived them all, that I was using a loophole to steal the festival from her, and that the HOA would not stand for such tyranny. It was classic Karen, taking her failure and trying to twist it into a story where she was the victim, but her words were met with groans and laughter from people who had seen through her act. Still, she pressed on, waving her arms, calling me greedy, selfish, and corrupt, and I could feel her eyes flicking toward my mansion as though trying to summon me out with the force of her voice. By early afternoon the situation boiled over. Several guests who had already lost patience marched up to the gate and demanded entry, threatening to climb over if Karen didn't sort it out. She tried to calm them with promises of an after-party elsewhere, but they were having none of it. When a burly man in a tank top hoisted himself up onto the bars and attempted to swing over, the crowd cheered, only for him to land in the mud on the other side with a thud and limp back sheepishly when he realized there was no stage, no tents, and certainly no festival waiting for him. The laughter that erupted only deepened Karen's humiliation, yet in typical fashion she spun on her heel and shouted that I had dismantled the festival grounds during the night out of spite. The lie was so outrageous that even her own friends covered their faces, unwilling to defend it, but she doubled down, claiming she had photographic proof on her phone which conveniently died just as she reached into her bag. The groans of disbelief were louder than the music that sputtered weakly from the last surviving speaker, and I could see Karen's desperation mounting like a storm cloud ready to burst. Her next move was as predictable as it was pathetic. She pulled out her phone charger, demanded someone start up a generator from one of the food trucks, and announced that she was calling her lawyer. The crowd perked up at this, some muttering that perhaps legal action would resolve the mess, others scoffing at the idea that anyone would take her case. I knew the truth, of course, because I had dealt with Karen's so-called lawyer before, a family friend who was more accustomed to drafting wills and handling small claims than waging wars over imaginary HOA authority. Still, Karen dialed furiously, pacing back and forth, voice rising as she explained that her event had been hijacked by a greedy landowner who was locking innocent people out. I imagined the poor lawyer on the other end, sighing into his receiver, trapped in the whirlwind of her hysteria. When she hung up, she plastered on a triumphant smile and shouted that the matter was going to court, that she would have an injunction filed immediately, and that all of them would see justice served by the end of the day. The guests were unimpressed. One shouted that legal battles take months, not minutes. Another yelled that they didn't care about her feud with me, they just wanted their money back. Karen snapped at them, promising full refunds but dodging the question of how she would actually provide them. Her voice cracked with emotion, swinging between anger and desperation, tears glimmering at the edges of her eyes even as she tried to bark orders at the vendors to stay put. Most of them ignored her, packing up their equipment and driving away, unwilling to waste another hour on a lost cause. Each departure chipped away at the illusion she was trying so desperately to maintain, and by the time the taco truck roared down the road in a cloud of dust, the once festive energy had soured into an atmosphere thick with resentment. Karen's breaking point came when a group of particularly angry guests threatened to call the local news. They had filmed everything on their phones. The locked gate, the police visit, Karen's broken promises, and now they were threatening to send it all to reporters. Karen froze, her face paling, because she thrived on controlling the narrative, on spinning her version of the truth, and the thought of losing that grip terrified her. She launched into a speech about community solidarity, about not letting outsiders mock them, but her words were drowned out by jeers. Several guests began walking back to their cars, muttering about scams, and others lingered only to enjoy the free spectacle of watching Karen unravel in public. I sat on my porch, amused and yet slightly astonished at just how far she was willing to go. Most people would have cut their losses, slinked away, and hoped to salvage what little dignity they had left, but Karen was not most people. She dialed the police again, screaming into the phone that I was holding her festival hostage, demanding immediate action. When the officers returned, their patience was thinner than paper. They warned her bluntly that she was trespassing, that she had no legal claim to the property, and that if she did not disperse the crowd they would start issuing citations. Karen shrieked that this was an abuse of power, that she had rights as an HOA president, but the officers were unmoved, repeating that the law was on my side. The crowd erupted in laughter again, some recording videos, others egging her on just to watch the drama unfold. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage her pride, Karen made a show of rallying her remaining supporters. She promised them a free after-party at the community center, swore she would sue me for damages, and vowed that the HOA would strip me of every so-called privilege I enjoyed. Her voice shook with fury, and for a moment she looked almost unhinged, eyes wild, gestures frantic. The once orderly event had devolved into chaos, her grand vision nothing more than a roadside tantrum, and yet she clung to the fantasy that she was in control. People began drifting away in groups, laughing and shaking their heads, some shouting sarcastic goodbyes as they left her standing there alone with her clipboard, a few empty chairs, and the stubborn padlock that had bested her. As evening settled in, Karen remained by the gate, glaring at my mansion as though her stare alone could burn it down. The crowd was gone, the food trucks vanished, the music silent, but she lingered, muttering into her phone about legal strategies and rallying the board. From my porch I raised a glass in her direction, savoring the peace returning to the lake as night fell. The padlock hung silently on the gate, untouched, victorious, and I knew that while the day had ended in her humiliation, Karen's obsession with winning would not die here. Tomorrow she would come back with new tricks, new lies, maybe even new allies, but tonight belonged to me, and I relished the quiet laughter bubbling in my chest as I watched her retreat into the shadows, plotting revenge that would never succeed. For me, the battle had already been won with one simple click of a lock, and the war she imagined was just a comedy show I intended to enjoy from the best seat in the house. The morning after Karen's grand failure should have been quiet, the kind of morning where the lake returned to its natural calm, yet the mess she had left behind lingered both in the physical sense and in the air thick with gossip. Beer cans and discarded wristbands littered the roadside like confetti from a parade that had ended in disaster, tire marks cut through the ditches where people had sped away in frustration, and neighbors stood in small clusters whispering and chuckling about how the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA had fallen flat on her face. I expected Karen to retreat in shame, to lick her wounds in private and pretend none of it had happened, but Karen's pride was built from something more stubborn than cement, and instead of silence she came back louder than ever, clinging to her illusion like a drowning sailor clings to driftwood. It started with her on social media, where she posted shaky videos blaming me for everything, calling me a tyrant who had ruined a beautiful community event, and demanding her followers support her in exposing the so-called injustice. Her words were dramatic, full of phrases like robbed of our rights and standing strong against greedy landowners, but the shaky camera and the visible gate with the shining padlock in the background told a story far funnier than the one she was trying to spin. What Karen had not counted on was the internet's ability to sniff out a spectacle, and soon her livestream was clipped, shared, and mocked by people far beyond our neighborhood. Within hours strangers were laughing at her meltdown, memes popping up of her screaming in front of the gate with captions like Festival of Lies and Padlock Party. Instead of sympathy, she had gained infamy, and the more she posted, the worse it became. In one particularly ridiculous video, she stood with her arms spread wide and declared she would break the gate down by any means necessary, only to fumble with a pair of bolt cutters she clearly did not know how to use. She grunted and strained for the camera, her face red, sweat dripping, only to fail spectacularly as the cutters barely scratched the thick chain. The clip went viral, replayed endlessly with sound effects added, and comments poured in calling her the queen of entitlement, the HOA dictator, and even naming her festival flop of the year. I watched the chaos unfold from the comfort of my porch, sipping cold drinks and scrolling through the endless barrage of internet jokes at her expense. It was a show better than anything she could have organized, a comedy special starring her own arrogance, and I didn't have to lift a finger beyond snapping a lock shut. Still, Karen was relentless. Embarrassed but unwilling to quit, she doubled down by holding an impromptu press conference at the gate, dragging along a couple of her dwindling supporters and a shaky tripod for her phone. She shouted about lawsuits, about property rights, about how I had supposedly signed a verbal contract in front of multiple witnesses, though none of those witnesses ever appeared on camera. She even tried to invoke obscure legal jargon she had clearly Googled the night before, tossing around words like easement and public access as if saying them enough times would transform them into reality. Her followers cheered weakly in the background, their voices drowned out by the honks of passing cars and the occasional laughter of neighbors who had gathered just to watch her humiliate herself again. But the most delicious moment came when one of her supposed guests stepped forward during her broadcast and demanded his money back. He waved a crumpled flyer in her face, shouting about how he had paid cash for a weekend pass and had nothing to show for it. The camera caught every second of her stammering response, her hands flailing as she promised refunds that she could never deliver, and the crowd erupted in arguments. More people came forward, holding wristbands and receipts, demanding answers, and the video spiraled into chaos as Karen tried to shout over them, insisting that I had sabotaged her finances as well as her event. The internet devoured it, labeling it the greatest HOA scam caught on tape, and Karen's name spread far and wide, not as a leader or organizer but as a living punchline. Her humiliation might have been enough for most people, but Karen was not most people. She took her vendetta to the HOA board, gathering them in a meeting where she ranted about my supposed abuses and demanded they take collective action against me. Unfortunately for her, many of them had already seen the videos, and while some were too polite to say it out loud, others openly laughed at her claims. Still, Karen pressed on, filing complaints, threatening to fine me for community disruption, even drafting a letter she intended to circulate accusing me of fraud. What she did not realize was that every step she took only deepened her downfall, because by then the story had spread so far that even local news outlets began sniffing around, curious about the woman who had promised a lake festival and delivered a roadside fiasco. When reporters finally came knocking, I greeted them warmly, offering a calm explanation of how Karen had attempted to trespass and host a 100-guest bash on property she did not own. I showed them the deed, the signs clearly stating private property, even the security footage of Karen trying and failing to cut through the gate. They ate it up, chuckling at the absurdity of it all, and when the segment aired that evening, Karen was painted not as a victim but as a caricature of entitlement gone wrong. Clips of her ranting were spliced with my cool, collected commentary, and the contrast only made her look more unhinged. By the time the piece ended, Karen was trending again, not for her leadership but for her complete lack of self-awareness. What made it even sweeter was watching how the very people who had once supported her turned against her. Neighbors who had once endured her bossy tone and constant interference now openly mocked her, whispering about her failed festival every time she walked past. Guests who had been duped into paying demanded restitution, some even threatening to sue her personally. The HOA board began distancing themselves, claiming they had never approved her event, leaving her stranded in her own mess. Karen tried to spin it, tried to call herself a martyr fighting against corruption, but no one was buying it anymore. Every word she spoke only fed the fire of ridicule, every outburst became another meme, and every attempt to regain control slipped further from her grasp. Yet Karen's pride refused to die. In one final act of desperation, she staged another dramatic scene for the cameras. This time she claimed she would reclaim her festival by storming the gate with a handful of so-called VIPs. She dressed in flashy clothes, carried a megaphone, and marched down the road as if leading a parade, chanting slogans about justice and right. Behind her trailed a small group of loyalists, more curious onlookers than real supporters, and they tried to hype her up as she delivered speech after speech about fighting oppression. When she finally ordered them to climb the gate, the result was comedy gold. One slipped and fell into the ditch, another got tangled in the chain, and Karen herself struggled to lift a leg over before giving up halfway, red-faced and panting into her megaphone. The cameras caught it all, the internet replayed it endlessly, and the legend of Karen's festival flop reached heights she could never have imagined. From my vantage point on the porch, I watched the spectacle with the satisfaction of a man who had won without lifting a finger. All it had taken was a single padlock, a bit of patience, and Karen's own arrogance to create a chain reaction of humiliation that would haunt her for years. As her followers drifted away, muttering about wasted time, she stood there alone again, megaphone limp at her side, eyes blazing with hatred as she glared up at my mansion. She shouted something incoherent about revenge, about lawsuits and justice, but her words carried no weight anymore. She was a punchline, a cautionary tale, a meme that would never die, and I knew she would never forgive me for it. But the truth was, I did not need her forgiveness. I had my peace, my lake, my mansion, and a story that would be retold around every neighborhood barbecue for years to come. The HOA Karen festival fiasco was over, and the padlock still gleamed at the gate, untouched and undefeated, the silent hero of the entire show. The fallout from Karen's failed festival had already spread beyond the neighborhood like wildfire, but if anyone thought that embarrassment and ridicule would finally silence her, they did not understand the sheer stubbornness that defined every fiber of her being. Karen thrived on conflict like oxygen, and instead of retreating into quiet shame, she reemerged with a new plan, one that she promised her shrinking circle of supporters would restore her dignity and prove that I was the true villain in the story. It began with papers delivered to my mailbox in an envelope stamped with the name of her lawyer, the same small-town attorney who once bungled a will for a family down the street. The language was grandiose, full of threats about injunctions and damages, accusing me of unlawful interference, emotional distress, and even community sabotage. I laughed so hard reading it that I nearly spilled coffee on the pages, because the very idea that her trespass and scam festival had somehow turned me into the aggressor was comedy in its purest form. Still, I kept the letter carefully folded and placed it in my files because I knew Karen would push this stunt as far as it could go, and having evidence was always satisfying when the truth came to light. The lawsuit threats did not stop at letters. Karen demanded a special HOA board meeting, claiming the community needed to unite against me, the so-called tyrant who hoarded land and denied neighbors access to resources. She twisted her words to make it sound like I had personally robbed people of summer fun, and she ranted about how my selfishness had cost the neighborhood thousands in lost opportunity. The meeting was packed, not because people supported her but because everyone wanted to see how far she would go this time. Cameras rolled, neighbors whispered, and Karen stormed into the room with binders full of papers and a slideshow she had cobbled together overnight. She accused me of being a menace to the community, of weaponizing my property against innocent families, of destroying the spirit of togetherness. When it was my turn to speak, I simply held up the deed to my land, a copy of the police report from the festival fiasco, and a tablet playing the viral video of her struggling with bolt cutters. The laughter in the room drowned out anything she tried to shout, and by the time the meeting ended, the board quietly voted down every one of her proposals. For most people, this would have been the end, but Karen had no reverse gear. She pivoted to another scheme, this time trying to rally her remaining allies into staging a demonstration at my property. She called it a freedom march, plastered flyers around the neighborhood, and invited anyone who wanted to protest against so-called gate tyranny. On the appointed day, she showed up at the road with maybe a dozen people, some holding poorly written signs, others there only out of curiosity. She grabbed a megaphone and began chanting slogans, pacing back and forth in front of the gate like a general leading troops into battle. The padlock hung there silently, gleaming in the sunlight, defying her with every click of the chain swaying in the breeze. The chanting never caught on, the crowd looked bored, and a few eventually drifted away. Still, Karen kept shouting, her voice cracking, her hair sticking to her sweaty forehead, until finally she announced that if the system would not give her justice she would take it by force. That night she returned under cover of darkness, convinced no one was watching. I had been expecting it, of course, because Karen was as predictable as the sunrise when it came to doubling down. My cameras caught every detail, from the moment her headlights dimmed as she parked down the road to the hushed instructions she gave a small group of loyalists carrying flashlights and bags of tools. They crept toward the gate, fumbling with the chain, whispering about how this time they would cut it clean and march right in to reclaim what they thought was theirs. What they didn't know was that I had upgraded the lock, reinforced the chain, and set up motion sensors tied to sprinklers and alarms. The moment they began tugging, a piercing siren wailed through the night and jets of icy water sprayed down from hidden nozzles, drenching them from head to toe. Karen shrieked as her hair flattened against her head, mascara running down her cheeks, and her crew scattered like startled animals. The cherry on top came when the geese I had recently welcomed to the property decided they had had enough of the disturbance and charged at the intruders, wings flapping, beaks snapping, honking like fury unleashed. Karen and her companions bolted down the road, slipping in the mud, screaming as the geese chased them to their cars. The footage was priceless, and I didn't have to release it myself because one of her own allies had been streaming the whole thing live. By morning the internet had a new round of memes, this time dubbing her Operation Goose Chase and layering her shrieks with comical sound effects. She tried to spin it by claiming I had used unlawful force and even accused me of animal cruelty for letting the geese guard my property, but no one believed her anymore. The HOA board called another meeting, not to punish me but to address the mounting embarrassment she had caused the entire community. Members muttered about liability, about how her antics were dragging them into unwanted spotlight, and for the first time I saw cracks forming in her support even among the most loyal busybodies. Yet Karen still had one card left to play, and she played it with the desperation of a gambler down to their last dollar. She filed the lawsuit officially, dragging me into a courtroom where she strutted in with her lawyer and a pile of binders stuffed with half-baked evidence. She painted herself as a victim of malicious intent, claiming I had inflicted emotional trauma, financial loss, and even social isolation by refusing to open my land for her event. The judge, a no-nonsense man with little patience for theatrics, listened to her long-winded speeches with raised eyebrows and then turned to me. I simply presented the deed, the police report, and the viral footage of her antic. The courtroom burst into laughter more than once as her lawyer fumbled to object, and Karen's face turned the shade of a ripe tomato. The judge dismissed the case within minutes, not only throwing out her claims but warning her against wasting the court's time in the future. She stormed out of the courtroom red-faced and muttering threats, followed by reporters eager to catch her reaction. When she realized she could not win in court, she tried one last stunt, sneaking onto the property again in broad daylight with a handful of her so-called VIPs. They clambered awkwardly over the fence, tearing their clothes on the wire, and landed ungracefully on the other side. Unfortunately for them, they landed directly into the path of the motion-activated sprinklers and tripped another alarm. The chaos that followed was nothing short of slapstick. Sirens blared, water drenched them, and to make matters worse, the raccoons that had made a home near the boathouse decided to investigate the intruders. Karen shrieked as the creatures skittered around her feet, one even climbing onto her leg before leaping away. The VIPs screamed, flailed, and scrambled back over the fence, leaving Karen behind as she slipped in the mud and landed flat on her back. By the time she managed to scramble over, covered in grime and dripping wet, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the roadside, laughing and recording every second. It was the final straw. Even the HOA board, tired of being dragged into her disasters, convened and voted to censure her. She lost her title, her influence, and what little shred of dignity she had left. She tried to rally against them, shouting about betrayal, but the room was filled with chuckles and rolled eyes. By the time the meeting ended, Karen was a dethroned queen, stripped of her imaginary crown, and reduced to a punchline in her own kingdom. For me, the entire ordeal had been a masterclass in patience and timing. I had not needed to shout, to argue, or to lift more than a padlock and a chain. Karen had orchestrated her own downfall with every outrageous decision, every desperate stunt, and every shrieking live stream. That night I sat on my porch, the lake calm, the air cool, and the only sound the gentle lap of water against the shore. The padlock still hung on the gate, solid and untarnished, a silent monument to the absurd war that Karen had waged and lost. In the distance I could see the faint glow of houses, neighbors no doubt laughing at fresh memes and swapping stories about her latest fiasco. I raised my glass to the padlock, to the geese, to the sprinklers, to every detail that had worked in my favor, and I thought how fitting it was that one woman's arrogance had turned into the neighborhood's greatest comedy saga. Karen was not finished in her own mind, people like her never were, but the world had already moved on, laughing at her expense, and I was left with peace, victory, and the knowledge that no matter what she tried next, the gate would always hold. In the days that followed Karen's last humiliating defeat, the neighborhood slowly began to settle into a new rhythm, one that was defined not by her constant meddling or shrieking voice but by the absence of her control, and it was almost surreal to witness. For years Karen had injected herself into every situation, every meeting, every dispute, always twisting narratives until she was the central character, but now she was a figure of ridicule, a walking cautionary tale whose name alone made people smirk. The HOA board had stripped her of her title, her loyal followers had either abandoned her or retreated into embarrassed silence, and the endless barrage of internet memes had ensured that her reputation was permanently stained with the mark of failure. Clips of her screaming at the gate, fumbling with bolt cutters, and running from geese played on loop across platforms, edited with sound effects, auto-tuned remixes, and parody skits, and no matter how desperately she tried to spin the story, she could not escape the fact that she had become the very thing she despised most, a joke too big to be ignored. I enjoyed every second of it, not out of cruelty but out of the simple satisfaction that came from watching someone so arrogant finally collapse under the weight of their own ego. The HOA's vote to remove her had been unanimous, and the meeting itself turned into a spectacle. People who once whispered their frustrations about Karen finally spoke aloud, sharing stories of her bullying tactics, her fines over trivial matters, her constant power plays. Neighbors who had suffered silently for years found their voices, and the board, sensing the winds had shifted, eagerly distanced themselves from her. When the decision was announced, the room erupted in applause, something that had never before happened at any HOA meeting, and Karen, standing red-faced at the back, tried to shout about betrayal and conspiracies. Her words fell flat, drowned out by the clapping and cheers, and she stormed out, her once faithful allies scattering like leaves behind her. It was not just a loss of power, it was an exile, a moment that marked the end of her reign. The irony was that she had staged the whole thing herself. If she had not tried to host her ridiculous festival, if she had not turned her obsession with controlling my land into a community crisis, she might still have her position. But Karen could never resist going too far, and in the end, it was her own excess that destroyed her. Watching her downfall unfold gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. For years I had endured her constant intrusions, the letters taped to my door, the complaints about my landscaping, the snide remarks about how my lake mansion was too private, too exclusive. Every battle with her had felt like a grind, a war of attrition where patience was my only weapon. But this time, patience had paid off in spectacular fashion. I hadn't needed to shout or argue, I hadn't needed to threaten or retaliate. All I had done was secure my gate and watch as Karen's own lies pulled the rug out from under her. It was the kind of victory that felt poetic, a simple action unraveling a mountain of arrogance, and I savored it in the quiet evenings when the sun dipped low over the water and the only sound was the soft call of loons. The wider world had its own way of sealing Karen's fate. Local news stations ran follow-up stories about the fiasco, painting me as the calm homeowner who had endured an outrageous attempt at trespass while portraying her as the caricature of entitlement. National outlets picked it up too, folding her story into the endless stream of viral HOA horror tales that fascinated audiences everywhere. Strangers who had never set foot near our lake laughed at her antics, shared jokes about her festival flop, and marveled at the sheer audacity it took to invite 100 people to a mansion she didn't own. Karen had wanted to be famous, and in a twisted way she got her wish, but it was not the fame she envisioned. Instead of admiration, she was met with ridicule, her face plastered across headlines that mocked her, her name now shorthand for absurd entitlement. No matter how hard she fought to reclaim her dignity, the internet had locked her story in place, immortalizing her not as a leader but as a meme. Back in the neighborhood, life was better without her. Without Karen's constant interference, meetings became shorter, friendlier, and surprisingly productive. People who had once kept their heads down began suggesting real improvements, things like community gardens and lake cleanup days, ideas that actually mattered instead of fines for minor violations. Laughter replaced bickering, cooperation replaced suspicion, and it was almost shocking to realize how much of the community's tension had been tied directly to Karen's relentless need for control. The irony was not lost on me that by trying to stage her grand event on my land, she had inadvertently freed the entire neighborhood from her grip. For once, people could breathe without her shadow looming over every decision. As for me, I relished the peace. My lake was quiet again, my mansion secure, the padlock still hanging proudly from the gate as a symbol of the entire debacle. Every time I walked past it, I felt a surge of satisfaction, remembering the look on her face when the chain refused to yield, the way her voice cracked as she tried to keep her crowd calm, the way she shrieked when sprinklers and geese turned her midnight raid into a comedy show. The padlock was more than metal and steel now, it was a reminder of the power of patience, of the futility of arrogance, and of the simple fact that sometimes the best victories are the ones where your opponent destroys themselves. Friends and neighbors joked that I should bronze it, mount it as a trophy, and part of me considered it, because in many ways that padlock had done more than keep intruders out, it had given the entire community its freedom back. Karen did not vanish completely, of course. People like her rarely do. She lingered at the edges, still ranting online, still trying to paint herself as a wronged woman fighting against oppression. But her audience was gone, her supporters silenced by the weight of evidence and the endless ridicule. Every attempt she made to claw her way back into relevance only reignited the mockery, every post she wrote only became another screenshot for strangers to laugh at. She was trapped in a loop of her own making, each move digging her deeper, and I no longer had to lift a finger. The war was over and she was fighting shadows. In the quiet moments after it all ended, I thought about how high the stakes had seemed when it began. At first, it had been about protecting my property, my peace, my home. It had felt serious, urgent, even dangerous when Karen first announced her festival and 100 strangers threatened to descend on my land. But as the story unfolded, it had transformed into something else entirely, a theater of absurdity where her every move became comedy, where her defeat became inevitable the moment she opened her mouth. I realized then that the best kind of justice was not always delivered in courtrooms or through police intervention. Sometimes justice came in the form of a padlock, a chain, a camera, and a little patience. Sometimes the universe needed only a small push, and arrogance would do the rest. The final twist came not from Karen but from the HOA itself. With her gone, the board extended an olive branch to me, acknowledging that the fiasco had been a failure of oversight and inviting me to re-engage with the community in a more positive way. For years I had avoided them, preferring isolation to arguments, but this time I accepted. At the next meeting, I walked in with a tray of coffee, greeted warmly instead of with suspicion, and for once the atmosphere was light-hearted. Someone even joked about planning an event on my land, and the room erupted in laughter instead of tension. It was clear to everyone that the joke would never die, that Karen's festival would be retold for decades, but it would always end with the same punchline: a gate, a padlock, and one woman's spectacular downfall. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip behind the hills and paint the lake in gold and orange, I thought about how strange it all was, how a single chain had sparked an entire saga that spread far beyond our little neighborhood. I thought about the balance between arrogance and patience, about how sometimes the world needed people like Karen just to remind everyone else how not to behave. And as I raised a glass to the still water, to the quiet, to the geese waddling contentedly near the shore, I smiled, knowing that no matter what Karen tried next, she would never undo the legend of her own undoing. The padlock had won, the lake was mine, and peace, at long last, was the final prize.